I always knew my life as a geologist would be different, but I never imagined how extraordinary it would become during that freezing Arctic expedition. My name is Dr. Michael Thompson, and what I'm about to recount challenges not only science, but the very human understanding of our existence. It was a typical international expedition. Our group consisted of 8 researchers from different nationalities: Russians, Americans, Canadians, and Norwegians. We were mapping geological changes in the Arctic region, a job that required patience, resilience, and an almost inexplicable love for discovery. Since I was a child, I had been fascinated by rocks, by the way they told stories of eras no one else could witness. My father, a mining engineer, sometimes took me to the excavation sites where he worked, and I would spend hours holding pieces of granite or quartzite, imagining what those fragments had seen. He was the one who gave me my first geologist's hammer, a 10th birthday gift that I still carry today, even though it's worn and the handle is chipped. I think it was because of him that I chose this life. A life that led me to places like the Arctic, where the wind cuts like a knife, and the silence is so deep you can almost hear your own thoughts echoing. When I received the invitation for the expedition, I didn't hesitate. It was a unique opportunity to map rock formations exposed by accelerated melting and collect data that could help us understand how the planet was reacting to climate changes. I had spent months in the field before, in deserts, mountains, and even humid tropical forests. But the Arctic was different. There was a vast, relentless whiteness that made you feel small, almost insignificant. I loved that. I loved the challenge of working in temperatures that froze the air in your lungs, and the way the ice reflected sunlight in shades I didn't even know existed. Our team was a mosaic of personalities and experiences. There was Alexei, a burly Russian with a dry sense of humor who seemed never to feel cold, always smoking a cigarette he swore was the secret to surviving winter. Sarah, an American like me, was a sedimentology specialist with a loud laugh that echoed through the camp, even when the rest of us were too exhausted to talk. Pierre, the Canadian, was the quietest, meticulous, spending hours adjusting seismic sensors as if they were works of art. And Nora, the Norwegian geophysicist, had that sharp gaze that seemed to see beyond what was in front of her. The others, 2 Russians and another Norwegian, were more reserved but just as competent. Together, we were a machine, each bringing something unique to the table. We arrived in the Arctic in a noisy helicopter that shook so much I thought I was going to lose my breakfast. The pilot, a Swede who looked like he had seen it all, dropped us off at a temporary base set up on the ice, with reinforced tents and a generator humming day and night to keep us warm. The first thing I did was put on my thermal boots and step outside to feel the ground beneath my feet. The ice cracked in a way that made it seem alive, as if it were breathing, and the air had that clean, sharp smell that only exists in untouched places. I knew we were in a hostile environment, but also an incredibly preserved one, a natural archive waiting to be read. Our work began the next day. We spent hours setting up equipment, drilling ice and rock samples, and analyzing data on laptops that sometimes froze from the cold. It was a slow, meticulous process. I loved the hands-on part, holding the hammer, breaking pieces of ice to expose sediment layers, feeling the weight of history in my hands. At night, we gathered in the main tent to share what we had found. Alexei told exaggerated stories about expeditions in Siberia. Sarah made terrible jokes about penguins, even though she knew they didn't live in the Arctic, and I listened, mentally noting what each rock fragment was telling me. The routine was exhausting but rewarding. Each day brought something new, a layer of volcanic ash that could date back to an ancient eruption, a fracture in the ice revealing subtle tectonic movements, a pattern of erosion suggesting a very different climate thousands of years ago. I felt like a detective, piecing together clues from a case no one had ever solved. And despite the cold that seeped into our bones and the wind that sometimes seemed to want to tear us from the ground, I was happy. It was the kind of happiness that comes from doing what you love, from being exactly where you're meant to be. The others felt it too, each in their own way. Nora, for example, got excited about the data from her scanning equipment, talking about magnetic anomalies as if they were poetry. Pierre adjusted his sensors with a calmness I envied, and even Alexei, with his rough demeanor, had a sparkle in his eyes whenever we found something interesting. We were different, But we shared this passion, this need to understand what was hidden beneath the surface. I think that's what bonded us. What kept the team together, even when exhaustion hit, or when the generator failed and we spent hours in the dark, blowing on our hands to warm them. I had no idea in those early days that we were about to find something beyond what any of us could have imagined. At that moment, all I saw was the work ahead. The ice, the rocks, the data. All I felt was the cold on my face and the weight of the hammer in my backpack. All I wanted was to keep digging, to keep discovering. It was a typical expedition, like so many I had done before, but with something special because of the place, the people, the challenge. I was in my element, living the life I had always wanted, unaware that the Arctic held a secret that would shake the very ground I thought was so solid. Yes, it was a typical international expedition, until the 5th day. Up to that moment, we were just scientists doing our work, driven by curiosity and determination. I didn't know I was about to cross a line, that what I believed to be the limits of science was about to shatter like ice beneath my feet. But in those first days, all I had was the present. The sound of the wind, the scent of the cold, the weight of my tools in my hands. And for me, that was more than enough, more than... On the 5th day of our expedition, we faced a particularly intense snowstorm, and our visibility was practically zero. That was when Nora detected an anomaly in her underground scanning equipment. "Thompson, there's something strange here." The anomaly indicated an unusual rock formation, a hollow space right beneath our position. Using specialized drilling equipment, we began descending through the compact ice. Every meter drilled was an eternity of anticipation and tension. When we finally broke through the last layer of rock and ice, we entered a cave completely isolated from the outside world. The air was different, dense, with a strange smell I couldn't identify. The walls had a texture that defied any known geological classification. I was adjusting my tool belt when the storm began to intensify. The wind howled like something alive, throwing snowflakes against my face with such force that I could barely keep my eyes open. We had planned for a light day, just a few surface measurements, but the weather had other plans. We took shelter in the main tent, waiting for the worst to pass. But the noise outside was deafening, a constant roar that made the ground tremble. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to warm my hands on the mug, when Nora burst in, her face red from the cold and her eyes wide. "Thompson, you need to see this," she said, almost stumbling over her words. Her voice had a tone I had never heard before, a mix of excitement and something that sounded like fear. She held the tablet with the scan data, her fingers trembling as she pointed to an irregular line on the screen. "Look here. It doesn't make sense. It's like there's a void, a massive cavity, right beneath us." I leaned in to look, and there really was something strange. The signals showed a disruption in the layers of ice and rock, a space that shouldn't be there. My heart skipped a beat. Anomalies like this could be anything. A glitch in the equipment, a natural air pocket, or something no one had ever seen before. I called the others, and within minutes, we were all gathered around the tablet, talking over each other. Alexei suggested it could be a gas pocket, something common in permafrost regions, but Nora shook her head. "No, it's too structured. Look at the shape. It's almost geometric." Sarah asked if we could confirm with seismic sensors, and Pierre was already grabbing his equipment, mumbling something about adjusting the frequency. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This was big. I knew it, even without understanding why yet. We decided to drill. It wasn't an easy choice. The storm was still raging, and messing with the ice in these conditions was risky. But curiosity, that little creature that had been biting at us since day one, spoke louder. We set up the drilling equipment, a thermal drill that used hot steam to cut through the ice without damaging the layers. I stood beside Nora, helping guide the cable while she monitored the data. The sound of the drill was a deep hum competing with the wind, and steam rose in white clouds that froze in the air before disappearing. With every meter, my chest tightened. It wasn't just the physical effort, it was the feeling that we were about to open a door we weren't sure we should cross. It took us hours. The ice was as hard as steel, and in some spots we had to stop to replace the generator batteries, which groaned under the strain. My fingers were numb inside my gloves, and I could see the same exhaustion on the others' faces. Alexei exhaling smoke from a cigarette he lit with trembling hands. Sarah rubbing her arms to keep warm, Pierre obsessively checking the sensors. Nora never took her eyes off the screen, murmuring numbers to herself. 10 meters, 12, 15. Each update was like a drumbeat in the silence between us. Then, suddenly, the drill stopped resisting. The sound changed, from a heavy rumble to a hollow emptiness, and the cable went slack in my hands. "We're through," Nora said. I looked at her and saw the same shock I felt reflected in her eyes. We lowered a camera through the hole, one of those with infrared light we use to inspect fractures. The screen first showed only darkness, then shadows that began to take shape. It was a cave, immense, with walls that seemed too smooth to be natural. My stomach twisted. This wasn't a gas pocket. It was something much bigger. We descended with ropes, one at a time. I was the third after Alexei and Nora. The hole was narrow, and I felt the ice scraping my shoulders as I slid down, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. When my feet touched the ground, I nearly lost my balance. The air down there was heavy, humid in a way that made no sense so deep in the Arctic. It had a smell I couldn't put into words. Not mold, not earth, but something ancient, as if time itself had been trapped inside. I switched on my flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the walls. They had a faint glow, with a texture that seemed slippery, almost organic, yet at the same time as hard as stone. I ran my gloved hand over one, and I felt a faint tremor, as if the surface was responding to my touch. The others were just as bewildered as I was. Sarah crouched to examine the ground, mumbling something about impossible sedimentation. Pierre pointed his sensors in every direction, frowning as he read the numbers. Alexei let out a nervous laugh and said something in Russian I didn't understand, but his tone was that of someone who couldn't believe what he was seeing. Nora stood still, staring at the center of the cave, where our flashlight beams didn't yet reach. "This isn't in any textbook," she whispered, and I knew she was right. Everything I had learned, every geological classification I knew, didn't explain this. We were standing in a place that shouldn't exist, breathing air that didn't belong to our world. I didn't know what we were about to find in there, but I could feel that with each step forward, we were moving further away from everything I had believed to be reality. The cold was still there, but now it was different. It didn't just come from the ice, but from something I couldn't name. And in that moment, gripping my flashlight with fingers trembling not just from the cold, I realized that the Arctic was about to show me something beyond rocks and data. Something that would make me question everything I thought I knew. It was then that we discovered, right in the center of the cave, partially enveloped in a layer of crystal clear ice, something that I instantly understood did not belong to our known reality. A creature, if I can even call it that, completely different from anything we had ever documented in the history of mankind. Its body was humanoid. The skin, a grayish-greenish tone, seemed to have a texture that changed depending on the light hitting it. Its limbs were proportionally different from ours, with joints that suggested a completely distinct mobility. The skull was larger, with a bone structure that indicated a brain capacity far beyond what we know. We spent hours meticulously documenting every detail. We collected samples, performed scans with cutting-edge technology, and recorded every inch of that extraordinary discovery. I knew it would change everything. I was adjusting the beam of my flashlight, trying to understand the shadows dancing on the cave walls, when Pierre let out a muffled shout. "Here, look here." He was in the center, pointing at something the light barely reached. I walked over to him, the sound of my footsteps echoing on the smooth floor. And that's when I saw it. My heart stopped for a moment, as if the dense air of the cave had swallowed me whole. There, embedded in a wall of ice so clear it looked like glass, was it? The creature. I don't know how I knew right away that it wasn't from this world, but I felt it. It was standing, or at least appeared to be, with its body slightly leaning forward, as if frozen in the middle of a movement. The ice encased it like a transparent armor, preserving every detail. The first thing that caught my attention was the skin. It looked like it had tiny scales that reflected the environment. I got closer, breath caught in my throat, and saw that they weren't scales, but something between leather and metal, a texture I had never seen in any living being. I passed the light over its limbs and noticed the strange proportions. The arms were too long, ending in hands with fingers that seemed to have extra joints, and the legs had joints that bent at impossible angles for a human. The skull was what both scared and fascinated me the most at the same time. It was large, almost disproportionate to the body, with a smooth curve that suggested a brain much more developed than ours. There were no visible eyes, at least not like ours. Instead, there were two deep, dark cavities that seemed to suck in the light. The face, if I could even call it that, had no mouth or nose, but there were grooves that could be traces of something that had once been there. I stood frozen, staring, trying to process what I was seeing. "What the hell is this?" Alexei murmured, breaking the silence. He was beside me, the cigarette stub forgotten in his lips. Sarah approached with a camera, the flash firing in quick bursts that made the creature appear even more alien. "This isn't a common fossil," she said. "Look at the state of preservation. This is not millions of years old." Nora was already with the portable scanner, passing the red beam over the ice. No signs of decomposition. I took my hammer from my backpack, more out of habit than necessity, and approached the ice. I touched it lightly with the tip, and the sound was a sharp ting, like crystal. This wasn't ordinary ice. It was harder, purer, almost as if it had been made to protect what was inside. "Let's document everything," I said, trying to stay calm. "We don't know what it is, but we're not going to miss anything." We spent the next few hours in a controlled frenzy. Pierre set up the 3D scanning equipment, capturing every angle of the creature in a digital model. Sarah collected samples of the surrounding ice, scraping with a thermal spatula that hissed as it melted the outer layers. I stayed with the field notebook, writing down everything I saw, the approximate measurements, about 2 meters tall, maybe more, the skin texture, the curvature of the skull. My fingers trembled as I wrote, and it wasn't just from the cold. Nora used a portable spectrometer, analyzing the composition of the ice and murmuring things like abnormal nitrogen levels and traces of elements that shouldn't be here. Alexei, in turn, kept taking photos with a backup camera. The more I looked, the more questions arose. The strange joints suggested that it moved in a way I couldn't imagine. Maybe crawling, or jumping, or something completely different. The enormous skull indicated intelligence, but what kind? Did it think like us? Or was it something as alien as its body? And how had it stopped there, frozen in the ice? There were no signs of struggle, no scratches on the cave that suggested a capture. It was as if it had chosen that spot, as if it knew it would be there for a time I couldn't even calculate. I found myself thinking about all the things I had already unearthed: trilobite fossils, mammoth bones, layers of volcanic ash. All of that made sense, fit into the history geology had taught me. But this? This was a black hole in my understanding, something that sucked in all the rules and spit them back in pieces. As we worked, I felt a weight growing in my chest, a mix of excitement and fear. I knew we were making history, but I also knew we were messing with something that could swallow us whole. When we finished the first round of analysis, it was already dark outside, or at least what passed for darkness in the Arctic at that time of year. We gathered around the creature, the lantern lights reflecting off the ice. "This changes everything," Nora said, echoing what I was thinking. "It's not just geology now, it's something else." I nodded, feeling the weight of those words. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just a scientific discovery. It was a mystery that would force us to look at the world in a new way. And I knew, as I put away my notebook and looked at that eyeless face, that my life would never be the same again. The international scientific protocols were immediately triggered. Within 48 hours, a special NASA team arrived to remove the creature. I saw the care with which they handled it, as if they were manipulating a secret that could not be revealed to the world. Later, I discovered fragments of information that would complete the puzzle of that discovery. Inexplicable footprints on Mount Everest and a mysterious skull in Siberia showed anatomical and genetic matches with our find. Everything pointed to the fact that we were not facing an isolated case, but evidence of an ancient and intelligent presence that predates known human history. Today, years after that moment, NASA keeps the creature in secret facilities. My reports were censored, and this knowledge haunts me like a ghost. Science has always taught us that we are the center of the universe. But in that Arctic cave, I learned that we are just another chapter in a much older and more complex story. A story that is only beginning. I was still holding the notebook, the pages full of frantic notes, when the radio crackled in the tent. It was a dry, official voice telling us to ascend immediately. "Containment protocols," was the phrase that stayed in my head. We had no choice. We packed up the equipment in silence, each of us exchanging glances that said more than words could. The weight of what we had found crushed us, but there was also a fire, an urgency to tell the world. We climbed up the ropes, the Arctic cold greeting us like a slap to the face after the dense air of the cave. Up there, the storm had calmed, but the sky was gray, heavy, as if it knew what was happening. 2 days later, they arrived. I heard the helicopters before I saw them, a deep rumble that cut through the silence of the ice. Men in black uniforms, without badges, descended with metal boxes and machines I had never seen before. One of them, a tall guy wearing sunglasses despite the weak light, introduced himself as Dr. Evans, NASA. There was no warmth in his voice, only efficiency. "You did a good job," he said. But it was as if he was talking about a routine report, not something that was turning science upside down. They entered the cave with military precision, and I stood watching, helpless, as they cut the ice around the creature with thermal lasers. I saw when they placed it in a containment capsule, the alien body floating in some liquid that glowed faintly. Their care was obsessive, special gloves, masks, sensors that beeped with every movement. One of the technicians looked at me for a second, and I swear I saw something like pity in his eyes before he turned his face. In a few hours, it was over. They sealed the capsule, loaded everything into the helicopters, and disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind only the hole we had made and a silence that weighed tons. "Don't speak about this," was the last thing Dr. Evans said before leaving, an order, not a request. In the following days, I tried to process what had happened. Our team disbanded quickly. Alexei returned to Russia, Sarah was called to a conference in the United States, Pierre and Nora disappeared into their own worlds. I stayed at the base for another week, reviewing the data we had managed to save. But then came the emails, the phone calls, the warnings. Confidentiality, global security, higher scientific interest. My original report, with every detail of the creature, was replaced by an edited version that only spoke of indeterminate geological anomalies. My personal notes were confiscated in a surprise visit from 2 agents who didn't identify themselves. I fought to keep at least the photos, but even they disappeared from the servers. It was months later, at a conference in Oslo, that I heard the first rumors. A retired mountaineer, drunk in a bar, talked about strange footprints he saw on Everest decades ago. Long, with toes that didn't look human. He said the expedition had been silenced, the records destroyed. I wrote everything down on a napkin. Later, on an online forum, I read about a skull found in a mine in Siberia, with DNA that didn't match anything known. The post disappeared hours later, but I had already made the connection. That thing in the cave wasn't unique. There was more, scattered around the world, hidden in places no one looked twice at. Today, years later, I live a strange life. I teach at a small university, lecturing on rocks and geological eras to students who have no idea what I saw. My hammer is still with me, but I don't use it anymore. It stays in a drawer, a reminder I don't know whether I love or hate. NASA never gave me answers. The creature is somewhere, locked in bunkers that don't appear on maps, studied by people I don't know. My expedition colleagues don't talk about it. The few I still see avoid looking at me when the Arctic comes up. I try to move on, but it's always there, in my dreams, with that huge skull and those strange eyes. I don't know what it was, where it came from, or why it was there. I don't know if it was a warning or a promise. But I know the story isn't over. As I walk through the streets of my city, looking at the sky that no longer has the pure white of the Arctic, I feel that something is coming. It's not the end, it's the beginning of something I can't predict, something that haunts and calls to me at the same time. The cave was just the first step, and whatever comes next, I know humanity is not ready. Maybe it never will be, but I was there, I saw it, and I carry it with me, a weight I can't let go of, a truth I can't forget.